Hey guys, so today's lesson is on completing the square. I linked to another video. You can watch that if you want more examples. I'm just going to work through an example on this worksheet. I like it because it has all of the steps written down on the left, all attach the worksheet so you could follow along if you want, or you can just use it to look at all the steps. Okay, so step number one in completing the square. By the way, completing the square is just another way of solving a quadratic, so finding the zeros. And it's not the best method to use, honestly, but it's a good method to use if it's not easy to find the factors. So just by looking at this equation, x squared plus 6x plus 2, this would be something on your homework that you might say is not factorable because there's nothing that multiplies to 2 but adds to 6. Although you can solve it. So even though you might say, oh, it's not factorable, it actually is, and you can actually solve for it. So that's what completing the square is helpful for. The first thing you need to do is make sure your equation is in standard form, and it is. So it needs to be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. Ours is in that form. You want to make sure that 0 is on the right-hand side. Next step to do is to add or subtract the constant from each side. So the constant is your c term. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and move the 2 over to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 2 because it's positive right now. All right, so now I have x squared plus 6x equals negative 2. Okay, I'm going to leave a blank here and you'll see why. Okay. Step 3 is to divide each term by the leading coefficient. Now, here we don't have a leading coefficient. It's technically 1. If we had a 2 there, then we would divide everything by 2, even the things on the right-hand side. But because we don't have one, that's not necessary to do. If you want, you could divide everything by 1, but it's not going to change anything. So I'm just going to do it just because. So divide everything by your leading coefficient, which is 1. So then we get x squared plus 6x blank equals negative 2 blank. Okay, so all we've done so far is move our c term, our constant, over and then divide everything by your leading coefficient. All right, so from here, what you're going to do is step 4. So step 4 says to divide the linear coefficient by 2 and then square the solution, okay? You're going to add that to both sides of the equation. So your linear coefficient is the one in the middle. Okay, this is your linear coefficient. And actually, when I underline, I'm just going to underline the 6, not the x. So your linear coefficient is just that number in the front. Okay, it's the coefficient of the middle term. So what you're going to do is divide it by 2. And then you're going to square it. Okay, so 6 divided by 2 is 3, and then 3 squared is 9. So what you're going to do now is you're going to add that 9 to both sides. So now it's going to be x squared plus 6x, and then I'm going to have plus 9, and then bring down everything on the other side, equals negative 2, and then plus 9. So you want to add it to both sides. If you do that, you're not changing the equation. You want to make sure you're balancing the equation. So again, you take the middle coefficient, which is 6, divide it by 2, and then square it. All right. Now what you want to do is you can actually factor. And sorry, I left out an x here. I shouldn't have done that. So now what you could do is factor. So on the left-hand side, this now becomes factorable, okay? It actually ends up being a perfect square trinomial. So two numbers that multiply to 9 and add to 6 are actually x plus 3 and x plus 3. Okay, and that's equal to, on the left-hand side, you could just combine those. Those are just numbers. Negative 2 plus 9 is 7. Now, on the left-hand side, you have x plus 3 times x plus 3. You're just going to write it as x plus 3 squared, because you have 2 of them, is equal to 7. Okay, now, I just want to make a note that this is always going to happen. You're always going to get a perfect square when you complete the square, okay? So it's always going to be something squared. And then just another tip, that number that you put here is always your b term divided by 2, okay? You can always try to think about it and think it through, but those are just some tips for you guys. Okay, Now we're actually not going to multiply this out, even though you kind of want to from the previous lessons that we've been doing. But instead, what you want to do is you want to take the square root of both sides. We want to get rid of this 2, okay? So to get rid of it, you take your square root. If you do it to one side, you do it to the other. All right, on your left-hand side, the radical cancels out with the square, so now you're left with x plus 3 is equal to, now on the right-hand side, the square root of 7. Okay, the square root of 7 is not a perfect square, so you're actually just going to leave it. Do not write a decimal, just leave it as a radical. But make sure you put the number, or I'm sorry, make sure you put plus or minus in front of it. That's because, for example, I'm just going to give you an example on the bottom of the worksheet. If you have something like the square root of 16, we know the answer is 4, but it could also be negative 4. Okay, and the reason for that is 4 times 4 is 16, and then negative 4 times negative 4 is also positive 16. So you're going to have a positive and a negative answer. So for that one, I'm just going to leave it as plus or minus radical 7. And then the last thing you want to do is solve for x. Okay, so solve for x at the end. X is almost alone. You just have to move the plus 3. So I'm going to subtract it to both sides. So I'm going to have x is equal to, because these cancel out. Now, you cannot combine these. One is in a radical, one is not. So the way to write it is to put your number that's not in a radical first, so negative 3. And then you're going to bring down the plus or minus radical 7. And that's it. That's your answer. So you could leave this as your answer, but I want you to know that this is the same thing as x equals negative 3 plus radical 7, and the other one is x equals negative 3 minus radical 7. Okay, so either one is fine. I'm not going to make you write it out like this right now. On your homework, you could leave it as this version up here, but just know that you could separate it so you have 2 roots. So the reason you couldn't factor it out the beginning is because your roots aren't nice whole numbers. They're actually rational numbers that end up being decimals or fractions. So just make sure you write it with the radical left in if you can't simplify it. Sometimes you will have a nice number. All right, so this is just a breakdown of how you do this. I'm going to walk you through the first problem of your homework. So your homework problem is, it's just completing the square. Up at the top, you kind of have a description. Again, it's the 8 steps that we use to solve. I'll do the last one with you guys. I'll have you guys do the first 3, and then I'll do the last one. Okay, so first thing, by the way, you could ignore the numbers on the left if you want to. You don't have to follow along exactly. So first thing you want to do is get rid of your coefficient. Okay, so right now it's plus 4, so I'm going to move it over. So I'm going to do minus 4. Okay, so now I'm going to have 3x squared plus 4x, and then blank equals, and then you could combine these. 3 minus 4 is negative 1. Okay. All right. Then you want to divide by your a term. So your leading coefficient, so mine is 3. So I'm going to divide everything by 3. All right. So now you want to go ahead and rewrite this. This is going to end up being x squared plus, leave it as a fraction if you can't simplify it, 4 over 3x. Blank is equal to, leave it as a fraction if you can't simplify, negative 1/3, and then blank. Sorry, I forgot to leave another blank up here. Okay, so 2 blanks. That's where you're going to add your term that completes the square. So to find our term that completes the square, you're going to take your b term, which is 4/3. You're going to divide it by 2 and square it. Now, this looks like craziness right now, so you can also rewrite it. So 4 over 3 divided by 2, and then you're going to square it. Okay, it's the same thing. Now, remember, you can't divide fractions. Instead, you multiply by changing the division to multiplication, and then the 2, take the reciprocal. So it's 1 over 2, and then you square that. So on the right-hand side, we have this, which could be simplified. You have a 4 and a 2, so I could divide both of them by 2. I'm left with a 1 and then a 2. So this ends up being 2/3 squared, and then all you want to do now is square that. So 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9. So that means on both sides we're going to add 4 over 9. All right, perfect. So from there, I'm going to erase some of this because I ran out of space. So now from there, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and factor. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you can go ahead and factor this. Okay, so now when you have fractions, it's kind of crazy to factor, but this is when the trick comes in. So what you could do is just put x, or your variable that you have, and then remember, whatever term goes here, it's really just your b term, which is 4 over 3 divided by 2, which we said is like multiplying by 1/2. Okay, that gives us 2/3. So really in the middle, we could just write plus 2/3. Okay, we're going to have 2 of those because we're completing the square. So square it and then set that equal to. On the right, you want to combine like terms. You have fractions with a denominator that's not common. So you want to change the first fraction, multiply by 3. So they have common denominators. This first fraction is now -3 over 9 plus the 4 over 9. That gives you 1/9. Okay, so now what you want to do is the same as your last problem. Just solve. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Okay, the radical cancels out with the 2, so I'm left with x plus 2/3. Okay, and then on your right-hand side, you have the square root of 1/9. Now, if you have the square root of a fraction, if you remember from the beginning of the year, you can split that up. It's just the square root of 1 over the square root of 9. And they're both perfect squares, so it just ends up being 1/3. But remember to put the plus or minus because you have 2 solutions. All right, and then now what you want to do, I could have actually dropped my parentheses here, but you want to isolate or solve for x. So now we're just going to get rid of the plus 2/3 by subtracting it away. And now I'm going to say x is equal to, remember this number goes first, -2/3. You want your plus or minus in the middle, so plus or minus 1/3. Okay, now I'm not going to leave it like that. I can actually split it up into 2 solutions. So I'm going to have x minus 2/3, or I'm sorry, x equals -2/3 plus 1/3, and the other one is x equals -2/3 minus 1/3. So the plus or minus gets split up into 2 different solutions. Okay, I can actually combine these. So for my first solution, -2 plus 1, so just the numerators. Okay, that's going to give me -1/3. The denominator stays the same. And then for the bottom one, I'm going to have -3 over 3, which just ends up being -1. Okay, so my first solution is x equals -1/3, and my second solution is x equals -1. Okay, I did the hardest one on the homework for you guys. So for your homework, you're going to complete the first 3 problems. Make sure you email me if you have any questions. That's it. Bye.